So what went wrong? The Angolans were insisting that it's merely a technicality by way of an accounting discrepancy. It's not theft and corruption, which was what sprang to mind initially.
Well, I think the problem is that this has been going on for a long time. For the last 20 years, there have been discrepancies in the oil accounts, and it all comes really down to the main oil company, Sonangol. When the IMF talks about quasi-fiscal operations, what it means is that Sonangol has really been acting as a government within the government for many years. And during the years of warfare, the only hard currency coming into the country was through oil. And so Sonangol ended up financing the government and actually doing some of its spending for it. And the trouble is that once the war finished 10 years ago, there's been a process to try and organize the accounts, but it hasn't completely finished. And so when the IMF found a discrepancy, $32 billion, that's almost a quarter of GDP, when they look to try and find out what caused this, they think it's actually to do with Sonangol actually spending a lot of this money and then it not being registered on the official budget.
Anyway, it sends out red flags, though, Edward, in terms of Angola's got a very bad reputation when it comes to fiscal and corporate governance in general. And there have been calls, particularly in the oil sector, for better transparency and better financial reporting. How seriously are authorities in Angola addressing this?
Well, I think maybe it's rather unfortunate that this came into the press, this discrepancy, because in fact the IMF never suggested that the money had been stolen. They said that there was a discrepancy that they're looking into, and in fact they're doing further research into it. But I think it's been picked up by a lot of advocacy groups because there is concern over transparency. I think it's unfair to say the government hasn't been addressing this. There have been enormous steps forward in terms of reform, particularly with the creation of the economy ministry and different ways of doing the fiscal accounts. But the essential problem with Angola is that Sonangol remains this island of efficiency. Other ministries in the government are not as efficient, and therefore Sonangol sucks in all of the talent and also a lot of the financing and the projects. And to break the company's stranglehold on the economy is something which will be a very long-term project. Ultimately, most of the best prospects are handled by Sonangol. So really, it's just a reflection of the way that the economy works there. And I think the fact that the government responded so quickly by offering to cooperate with the IMF, that is a positive sign.
Obviously, Sonangol being at the center of this entire debacle speaks to how important the oil economy is for financing broader development and infrastructure projects in Angola. We're told that this discrepancy of 32 billion amounted to something like 25% of GDP. So, as oil prices rise, as Angola's production output rises, the management of these funds and how this money is then put back into productive uses into the economy. What's the strategy? What's the program?
Well, I think it's absolutely right. I think this has really brought into focus the fact that there is still so much more work to be done on really clarifying what happens with these enormous inflows into Angola. The oil production in Angola is now heading back up towards 2 million barrels a day. It's something, a goal they've been desperate to reach for many, many years. And yeah, we are talking about billions of dollars here. The 32 billion is actually over the period 2007 to 10. So it's a very recent period. But part of the problem is also to do with the fluctuation of oil prices, which over the last 3 years have shot up and down quite dramatically, but also to do with the currency, because the way that they record these amounts in the official budget, the kwanza itself has been depreciating, there's been high inflation, so all of the figures just don't match up. I think one of the big issues for Angola for the next few years is, you could say over the last 10 years, they've finished what is this post-conflict catch-up growth. It's all about now the real essential building of new infrastructure, and they have gigantic projects on the table. We're talking completely new cities built from scratch. We're talking a bridge over the River Congo could cost as much as $2 billion. So extraordinarily enormous projects, and probably at least 20 airports they want to build. This will require huge amounts of financing, a lot of which will come from the oil revenue. So definitely the World Bank is on the case, so is the IMF, and they're drawing up these programs, but we're dealing with so much expenditure here. There is a concern that we're going to see similar discrepancies going forward, because the government just does not have the capacity to trace all of this expenditure efficiently.
And Edward, other modalities of financing, project financing, infrastructure financing, it can't all come from the fiscus. So the question is, where are the banks in Angola? Where are the private equity players in Angola? Because just to add to that, a caveat, apparently where you do have financial institutions, again, the government is a major shareholder via Sonangol. So that creates another sort of a dilemma.
Yes, well, this is not unusual in Africa, of course. I mean, there are many other countries as well where the government has large interests in the financial sector. I think the interesting thing is the financial sector has really grown in the last 10 years. It used to be dominated just by Portuguese banks, and that's quite the opposite now. There's over 20 commercial banks, and in fact, Standard Bank finally got its license last year. Ecobank, which is the bank I work for, has just applied for a license. We're hopeful that that will be awarded by the end of the year. So we're seeing new financiers coming in. There are Russian banks there as well, Spanish banks moving in. So there are more pods. But I think the problem is that in terms of the GDP of the country, its exports, it is dominated by oil. And that's why most Western companies who have experience with Angola know the enclave oil sector. They don't know the other parts of the economy.